Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is October 9, 2021, and this weekend we're doing a lot of Hanging with the Sockdem and BreadTube Gang clips in which I comment from a Marxist perspective on clips from other channels from the broad left, social democrats, radical liberals, anarchists, etc. In this video, I am going to be responding to libertarian communist platforms on authority, an anarchist take, or whatever the title is. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So, I am familiar with Friedrich Engels on authority. We did an audiobook of it here on the channel last year. Although it's one of Engels' better known works, I wouldn't say it's one of his major works by any stretch. It's extremely short. That said, I mean, it makes good, reasonable points. It is a general criticism of anarchism and, libertarian socialism. Basically the same thing, just different terms for it. And yeah, I know that anarchists frequently will rebut it just by saying that it's a straw man. I've never heard them say how it's a straw man because I am personally familiar with anarchism. I found it to be pretty apt. I mean, granted, Engels was writing quite a while ago, like 150 years ago. But that said, Marx and Engels were as familiar as anybody with anarchism and other kinds of utopian socialism which predate scientific socialism, which Marx and Engels created, basically by going through all of these existing left ideologies and critically analyzing them, taking what worked and discarding what didn't. Anarchism made the discard pile. Marx and Engels were not fans of anarchism. I'm also not a fan of anarchism. That's a conclusion I came to on my own, and then I realized that the reasons I didn't like it were the same reasons why Marx and Engels didn't think it made much sense, and Lenin also thought it was a disaster. So all of that said, I'm more than prepared to take this criticism of Engels on authority, and we will see what we can do. Libertarian Communist Platform has the floor.
Hello and welcome to Libertarian Communist Platform. One of the most often referred to texts arguing against anarchism is On Authority by Friedrich Engels. Leninists who use this text to argue against the organised principle of self-management either don't know that this has already been debunked countless times by anarchists or are willfully ignorant of theory.
Okay, well, that's certainly not a hostile introduction or anything. So, I don't know, which am I? First of all, it's Leninists, because no one else agrees with Engels. Okay, fine. How about Engelsists? How about that? This is not a work by Lenin. It's a work by Engels. So, yeah. Am I willfully ignorant? No, because that's what we do here at the channel. We have over 150 currently Marxist audiobooks online. That's what we do. We read and teach theory. So no, it isn't that. Am I just unaware that anarchists have, quote, debunked it? Okay, I don't think debunk is the right word. You can disagree with it, or you can refuse it, or whatever, but debunking, I don't think so. Anyway, so clearly the tone here is not a pleasant one. We'll make do.
I thought I would debunk it again to hopefully set the record straight as best I can. We're going to work through this point by point, so let's get started. A number of socialists have latterly launched a regular crusade against what they call the principle of authority. It suffices to tell them that this or that act is authoritarian for it to be condemned. This summary mode of procedure is being abused to such an extent that it has become necessary to look into the matter somewhat more closely. Authority, in the sense in which the word is used here, means the imposition of the will of another upon ours. On the other hand, authority presupposes subordination. Now, since these two words sound bad and the relationship which they represent is disagreeable to the subordinated party, the question is to ascertain whether there's any way of dispensing with it, whether, given the conditions of present-day society, we could not create another social system in which this authority would be given no scope any longer and would consequently have to disappear. On examining the economic, industrial and agricultural conditions which form the basis of present-day bourgeois society, we find that they tend more and more to replace isolated action by combined action of individuals. Modern industry, with its big factories and mills, where hundreds of workers supervise complicated machines driven by steam, has superseded the small workshops of the separate producers. The carriages and wagons of the highways have become substituted by railway trains, just as the small schooners and sailing feluccas have been by steamboats. Even agriculture falls increasingly under the dominion of the machine and of steam, which slowly but relentlessly put in the place of the small proprietors big capitalists who, with the aid of hired workers, cultivate vast stretches of land. Everywhere, combined action, the complication of processes dependent upon each other, displaces independent action by individuals. But whoever mentions combined action speaks of organisation. Now, is it possible to have organisation without authority? Okay, so first of all, Engels appears to be conflating.
Okay, so before we get into what Engels appears to be conflating, according to LCP here, yeah, I have the text open and I'm reading along with it. Basically, the gist of what Engels is getting at here is that as work becomes more and more complicated, using more and more complex technology and larger combinations of workers to operate said technology, there is just a certain flow to that work which nobody can really argue with. It's set by the tools, it's set by the means of production themselves, and we just sort of have to go along with that. And that basically, he hasn't really gotten to this yet, but the thing about the actions of individuals being superseded by large combinations of workers under the supervision or control of capitalists, meaning that the anarchist insistence on the individual, this is being partly swept away just by technology. Work is no longer done on an individual basis. The only sort of people who retain this individuality are capitalists. It's a very bourgeois sensibility in this age. So anyway, with that sort of understanding there, let's listen to this very breathless rant from LCP.
Collective organisation with hierarchy. Anarchists see the freedom of all as the necessary premise and confirmation of the freedom of each. Mikhail Bakunin and Karl Marx, although they had a lot of disagreements, had a similar conception of what freedom is. They both held that a materialist conception of freedom is eminently social. In Man, Society and Freedom, Bakunin writes, "Man completely realises his individual freedom, as well as his personality, only through the individuals who surround him, and thanks only to the labour and the collective power of society." Bakunin continues and says, "Man becomes conscious of himself and his humanity only in society, and only by the collective action of the whole society. He frees himself from the yoke of external nature only by collective and social labour, which alone can transform the earth into an abode favourable to the development of humanity." The anarchist argument is that collective action, contrary to negating the freedom of the individual, actually helps human beings to develop. Anarchists are therefore not against collective organisation.
Okay, jumping in again, that's not true of all anarchists. So I regret to inform you, maybe you, as an ANCOM, libertarian communist, maybe you have that pro-social view. Not all anarchists do, particularly as you get into pure black flag anarchists. There's a lot of weird stuff in there. So, you started out, LCP, with this very sort of, hostile, you're going to take down Engels. Are you just willfully ignorant or what? Honestly, what you just said, maybe it's true of anarcho-communists, but yeah. Anyway, also, just for clarity's sake, the thing that was being conflated was collective action with hierarchical organization. I don't think that that's true. I don't think that that was being conflated, but that sort of I cut off in the middle of the word. That was the beginning of that segment. All right, continuing.
Collective organisation is a necessary part of anarchism. It is absurd to suggest that just because there needs to be social coordination of industry, that therefore hierarchical authority is justified. Let's continue with Engels' writing. Supposing a social revolution dethroned the capitalists who currently exercise their authority over the production and circulation of wealth. Supposing, to adopt entirely the point of view of the anti-authoritarians, that the land and the instruments of labour had become the collective property of the workers who use them. Will authority have disappeared, or will it only have changed its form? Let us see. Let us take by way of example a cotton spinning mill. The cotton must pass through at least 6 successive operations before it is reduced to the state of thread, and these operations take place for the most part in different rooms. Furthermore, keeping the machines going requires an engineer to look after the steam engine, mechanics to make the current repairs, and many other labourers whose business it is to transfer the products from one room to another, and so forth. All these workers, men, women and children, are obliged to begin and finish their work at the hours fixed by the authority of the steam, which cares nothing for individual autonomy. The workers must, therefore, first come to an understanding on the hours of work, and these hours, once they are fixed, must be observed by all without any exception. Thereafter, particular questions arise in each room and at every moment concerning the mode of production, distribution of material, etc., which must be settled by decision of a delegate placed at the head of each branch of labour, or, if possible, by a majority vote. The will of the single individual will always have to subordinate itself, which means that questions are settled in an authoritarian way. In calling this authoritarian, Engels is ignoring the materialist conception of freedom as it's more or less agreed upon by Marx and Bakunin.
Okay, but wait a minute. So, as I just mentioned, not all anarchists are Bakuninists. Not all would agree with you. Some individualist anarchists do believe that the majority is a tyranny if they disagree and they don't want to respect majority rule. So, I mean, again, if you're agreeing with what Engels says here, why are you disagreeing with it, I guess? You know what I'm saying? It's if you don't actually have a problem with what he's saying, why are you getting so upset about it? And, you know, you could just easily say, as Bakunin following anarchists, we agree on these points. Why not just say that? Continuing.
The automatic machinery of the big factory is much more despotic than the small capitalists who employ workers ever have been. At least with regard to the hours of work, one may write upon the portals of these factories, "Leave, ye that enter in, all autonomy behind." If man, by dint of his knowledge and inventive genius, has subdued the forces of nature, the latter avenge themselves upon him by subjecting him, insofar as he employs them, to a veritable despotism independent of all social organisation. Wanting to abolish authority in large-scale industry is tantamount to wanting to abolish industry itself, to destroy the power loom in order to return to the spinning wheel. This is embarrassing. It's embarrassing for a number of reasons.
No, so I think you're going to say it's embarrassing because you agree with it. In which case, why don't you just say that you agree with the basic premise here and then disagree with the part that you disagree with? There's no need to go into hysterics over stuff that you don't actually disagree with. I have had conversations with anarchists who are like, I will burn your factory down because I won't work ever, blah, blah, blah. You know, if that doesn't apply to you, then maybe this essay doesn't apply to you, and maybe you don't have to get so angry about it. Just a thought.
Firstly, let's tackle this idea that you need mechanics and engineers and all of that. Bakunin notes that the authority of expertise in a given area is distinct from hierarchical authority. Authority, understood in terms of expertise, does not limit liberty, for the same reason that, in the middle of this pandemic, I listen to the advice of doctors and nurses to stay at home. I don't waltz around saying, "Oh, you're asking me to wear a mask, that violates my liberty. Rah, 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 I want to exercise my right to get sick and die." Because getting sick and dying, or putting other people at risk, does not enhance my freedom at all.
Okay, so again, I commend you for having a sensible position. And if you want to attribute that to Bakunin, I'm not going to stop you even. But you are aware plenty of people are not agreeing with that interpretation, which you and I both hold. That sometimes subordinating yourself to the public interest is actually good for you, rather than, the sort of contrarian, I, the individual, must always go against the grain, etc. That's not entirely a good representation of individualist anarchism or egoism and things like that. I would have to shift gears quite a bit to have that discussion. But since we seem to be in basic agreement about everything here, and, for example, you're finding Bakunin quotes to support the idea that technical expertise, which you don't want to call authority, okay, fine, if that's a taboo word for you, we won't call it authority, we'll call it technological expertise, whatever, then you don't disagree with Engels. You're just getting mad that he called it authority. But would that be worth making a whole video about? Or could you have said that in the first 20 seconds? You could have just said, the basic thing wrong with this essay is that Engels calls things authority which aren't totally authority. Actually, I agree with most of his points, just with not calling technical expertise authority. Thank you for listening to my essay, done. You could have done that, but instead there's this whole, hyperventilating rant that you're going on. That's not necessary.
Hence, I defer to the authority of doctors and nurses. Or, to quote Bakunin, does it follow that I reject all authority, perish the thought, in the matter of boots, I defer to the authority of the bootmaker. Anarchism is therefore entirely compatible with the idea of deferring to someone who has skills and knowledge. The second objection is that in Bakunin's other theoretical writings, he argues that society should be organised from base to summit and from circumference to centre. In other words, society should be organised from the bottom up rather than the top down by means of free federation of the associated producers. Free federation of the associated producers is entirely compatible with delegation. In fact, anarchists are generally in favour of a system of democratically elected, instantly recallable delegates to collectively manage things like large-scale industry. Another alternative would be rotation, i.e. everyone gets a shot at being a delegate. The third objection is, in a communist society, we seek to abolish the division of labour, and that goes straight back to Marx. And if that's what we're setting out to do, certain things do need to be worked out. There would be a lot of boring admin that would need to be done under socialism, but it would be very important that said admin is not monopolised and made the reserve of an elite class which organises things in its own interests. So we need to share the administrative labour if the overall division of labour is something we wish to overcome. Not only does this idea go back to Marx, but also workers establishing cooperatives in Argentina, for example, have experienced alienation because of the division of labour in said cooperatives. So the division of labour needs to be overcome as part of the revolutionary process, and that's an important objection.
Okay, so that to me is the first actual disagreement or partial disagreement, because actually Engels said nothing about you have to work the same job every day. He just said that you have a cotton spinning mill. He doesn't say anything about, whether people are working at other jobs, so that's a little bit of a straw man. He doesn't say anything about that. He just says that you need a schedule to be in place because the machines have to be operated in a certain way, and as long as that's the way the machines work, that's just the way that people have to work with them. So there's a certain amount of just stuff you have to work around, even if it's not your absolute desired outcome, just for the sake of the machines. That's kind of what he's getting at here. So, like a lot of that stuff that is an ostensible point of disagreement isn't actually in the text itself. This whole thing of division of labor and everything else. Engels hasn't actually even mentioned that. He mentions that there are decisions to be made about production, which can be made by elected delegates. You agree with that? Okay, no real disagreement there. Then you bring in all this stuff about us having a separate admin class which does things in its own interests. Okay, well, that would be capitalism. Capitalism administrates things in its own interests, etc. But obviously Engels was not in favor of capitalism, so, right. So I'm not actually hearing anything in this piece so far which you disagree with in and of itself, unless I've missed something here. Let's continue.
Let's continue with Engels' 19th century equivalent of a galaxy brain take.
Okay, so again, that's just not necessary. You've also agreed with the vast majority of what he said. What he's saying is just that authority changes form, and you're saying he's conflating with it hierarchy. No, he literally just said it changes form. Anyway, moving on.
Let us take another example, the railway. Here too, the cooperation of an infinite number of individuals is absolutely necessary, and this cooperation must be practiced during precisely fixed hours so that no accidents may happen. Here too, the first condition of the job is a dominant will that settles all subordinate questions, whether this will is represented by a single delegate or a committee charged with the execution of the resolutions of the majority of persona interested. In either case, there is a very pronounced authority. Moreover, what would happen to the first train dispatched if the authority of the railway employees over the passengers were abolished? This is, again, a question of expertise which, as I've already stated, anarchists have no problem with. However, I want to offer a counterexample here, which is the historian of the Spanish Revolution Gaston Laval's work, Collectives in the Spanish Revolution. Now, in fairness to Engels, this revolution was long after he died. However, if the word praxis means anything, then we should learn from what we've experienced and adjust our theory accordingly. Laval gives a detailed analysis of how anarchists managed the transportation system in Spain. Now, because of the conditions given by the Civil War and the energy and resource demands of that, organisation of the transportation system was difficult, but they did manage it, including railways and tramways. When I submitted arguments like these to the most rabid anti-authoritarians...
So wait a minute, what happened? You just cited an example and you were like, oh, well, Engels talks about railways. Well, they did railways. Okay, moving on. I don't actually get really confused here. I'm stuck on that. So your point is what? They didn't call it authority, but they... So this is like kind of a thing that comes up a lot where when ANCOMs break down the system that they think would actually, you know, be acceptable in practice, they wind up sort of describing the Soviet Union or like some other system that actually existed or exists, but which they denounce when it's actually sort of the logical, you know, non-idealist but put into practice versions of what they're talking about. It's like, congrats, you just wound up describing the thing that you regularly denounce. So what happened? So they managed a railway. Okay, great. How did they do that? Did they do it by, you know, did the trains run by burning printed copies of Engels on Authority? Like, how is this relevant to the argument? Engels is, by the way, not saying that you can't run a railway in a socialist system. He's definitely saying you can. He's just saying that authority exists in different forms in any kind of system, and it's sort of ludicrous to keep trying to pinpoint this as your stale objection to whatever the Marxists are proposing, which is still something that goes on to this day. You're agreeing with most of this essay, although you want to change some of the terms, fine, you still agree with the substance, yet you're not coming to the conclusion that you're in agreement. That's kind of what Engels is talking about, actually. All right.
The only answer they were able to give me was the following. Yes, that's true, but there it is not the case of authority which we confer on our delegates, but of a commission entrusted. These gentlemen think that when they have changed the names of things, they have changed the things themselves. This is how these profound thinkers mock at the whole world.
So honestly, what Engels says there is not that dissimilar from the it's not authority, it's expertise. So you're saying, okay, fine, this person has knowledge which justifies listening to that person. And I guess that you're trying to define authority down solely to types of authority which do not have that justification. Unfortunately, that really isn't what the word means. So anyway, I don't know why I bother. Let's just try to get through this.
Giving the left libertarians a fair hearing would detract from the elaborate strawman that Engels is constructing here. Engels never explains what said left libertarians meant by a commission entrusted. Bear in mind this is 19th century, so the language could have been different, or he may well be paraphrasing to suit his argument, which is probably the case, but in any case this renders analysis difficult, if nigh on impossible. In which case, I refer you to the previous example of the railways and tramways given by Laval. We have thus seen that on the one hand, a certain authority...
Okay, wait, so he's back to reading Engels now. But again, what about the example of the tram? How is that any different from what Engels said? How?
no matter how delegated, and, on the other hand, a certain subordination, are things which, independently of all social organisation, are imposed upon us together with the material conditions under which we produce and make products circulate. This is, again, embarrassing, because he is again conflating organisation with hierarchy, and we know already that a consistent social anarchist has to be pro-horizontal organisation.
He didn't say a thing about hierarchy. He did not say a thing about it. The word does not appear in this text. So we are talking about delegates because it is just point of fact, no matter what you believe, impractical to have every decision for, let's say, a room full of 50 people be decided on anew every single time it needs to be done. Particularly, I mean, the more decisions need to be made, the more impractical it is. So you've already agreed to delegates and commissions and things. Tremendous. Then what are you disagreeing with? Let alone calling embarrassing and all this other stuff. Tone it down. I mean, it's just so... you kind of make a caricature of yourself this way. You kind of become that person. You're like, oh, I'm not against all forms of authority. You're literally like spending all this breath disagreeing with someone you actually agree with. Do you see how that comes off as like a caricature of contrarianism?
It's not simply a kind of reckless, let's abandon all systems. Indeed, one experience I had as a demonstration was where I offered someone a free paper from AFED and they said, it just sounds like another system. And yes, it is another system, a better system. Let us continue reading. We have seen, besides, that the material conditions of production and circulation inevitably develop with large-scale industry and large-scale agriculture and increasingly tend to enlarge the scope of this authority. Hence, it is absurd to speak of the principle of authority as being absolutely evil and of the principle of autonomy as being absolutely good. Does it follow that I reject all authority? Perish the thought. I've already made this point, but just to drive it home, consider Tom Wetzel's On Organisation. I'm not sure when it was written originally, but on the Anarchist library it says it was retrieved in April 2017. So this appears to be quite recent, and Tom Wetzel had some criticisms to make of consensus, and he also talks about delegation from a libertarian communist perspective. Wetzel writes, it is possible to elect people to perform delegated tasks without creating a top-down organisation. Here are a few guidelines. The scope of authority of an elected person, such as correspondence secretary or treasurer, should be explicitly defined and delimited so that everyone knows what this person should be doing, and with the requirement of regular reports to keep the membership informed. The person should be elected for a limited term, such as 1 year, and should be subject to recall at any time by majority vote of the membership, but with the requirement of adequate notice to ensure that this is not sprung all of a sudden by those members least favourable to the person currently doing the job. If at all feasible, there should be a requirement of mandatory rotation from office. This is especially important for any position of acting as spokesperson or representative of an organisation or body of people. If an organisation is very small, however, it is sometimes difficult to rotate responsibilities. Even so, the person carrying out responsibilities can report regularly to membership meetings and can thus be directed by decisions of the membership. Nobody is to be elected to set policy for the organisation, but only to carry out those responsibilities that have been assigned by the membership. The general membership meeting of the organisation must remain the supreme decision-making body and can overrule any decisions of elected officers. The idea is that the main decision-making responsibility of the organisation is not to be delegated to some steering committee or executive, but is conducted directly by the membership through their own discussions and votes. This is the heart of the libertarian concept of organisation. And I think this is a very reasonable set of proposals. Most social anarchists would probably agree with this. And this is not a new idea. This idea of democratically elected, instantly recallable delegates was implemented during, for example, the great upheaval of the late 1870s, wherein railroad workers in the United States organised strike action not through the mainstream trade unions, but by delegation. All of this is compatible with anarchism, and it's dishonest to suggest that it isn't.
Okay. So let's try this again. So LCP here makes the distinction of he and other social anarchists, but then closes by saying, with anarchism, generally. So again, that's not totally consistent. If you want to say anarcho-communists or Bakuninists would agree with this, then great. Now, what was this whole sidetrack about delegates? What did that have to do with anything that Engels said? In fact, the word delegate does appear in this text. So we'll go back to that part. Quote, thereafter, particular questions arise in each room of the production facility and at every moment concerning the mode of production, distribution of material, etc., which must be settled by decision of a delegate placed at the head of each branch of labor, or if possible, by a majority vote. The will of the single individual will always have to subordinate itself, etc. So, what is your dispute with this? Just that Engels says that the single individual has to subordinate themselves to the majority, you don't consider that authoritarian? Okay, well, some anarchists would. Maybe not your kind of anarchists, but maybe we're not talking about your kind of anarchists. So the word delegate appears again in another section. Quote, here too, the first condition of the job is a dominant will that, speaking of the technology, that settles all subordinate questions. Whether this will is represented by a single delegate or a committee, in either case, there is a very pronounced authority. So what Engels is saying, he's not saying anything about hierarchy. You are. You are. And you alone are saying something about hierarchy. So maybe it's that you're interpreting these words in a way that he didn't mean them in the first place. What he's saying is that the form of the authority changes, but it is still there because there is still authority in the group that sometimes is going to go against the will of individuals. People cannot just wantonly do whatever they want and still have production turn out products. That is the point that I get out of this. I don't know, like, why you are trying to twist this into something other than, in my opinion, what it clearly is. So there's another line that was just quoted here, quote, hence it is absurd to speak of the principle of authority as being absolutely evil and of the principle of autonomy as being absolutely good. Meaning that when authority represents the group will, etc., that's, can be considered valid. I think that that's a point you agree with and that you've stated. So why don't you stop raging about it, right? Because it just comes off as pointlessly contrarian and kind of like wrecking, actually. So just because we're not using the word that you want us to use doesn't mean that we're not agreeing about the substance. And this idea about the principle of autonomy being absolutely good. Yeah, so this is the idea that, contrary to some individualist anarchists, which maybe doesn't include you, but it was in the audience that Engels was writing for. I'm sorry this doesn't revolve around you. You can't just do whatever you want and have society function. That's, to me, like a very simple point out of all this. Now, as far as the example of the recent thing from the Anarchist Library about how to have delegates that are instantly recallable and whatever, there's still authority there. The authority is in the people who elected that delegate and can recall that delegate. So the delegate has some autonomy to do X, Y, Z, but they're accountable to that body which gave them the authority to do what they're doing. They authorized them. That's authority. Gave them authority to go be a delegate. So that's what Engels is saying. It's absurd to speak of that principle as being absolutely evil. So if anyone's conflating anything, you're conflating authority with hierarchy. Engels is not. The rest of us are not. Maybe you could adjust your thinking accordingly.
Let's continue reading. Authority and autonomy are relative things whose spheres vary with the various phases of the development of society. If the autonomists confined themselves to saying that the social organisation of the future would restrict authority solely to the limits within which the conditions of production render it inevitable, we could understand each other. But they are blind to all facts that make the thing necessary, and they passionately fight the world.
So that Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what this guy is doing. It's just passionately fighting the world. Now, I mean, Engels could also be construed as meaning that the conditions of production are X, Y, Z, and an anarchist trying to say, no, I just don't want to work, and we'll still have goods and services anyway. Well, that would be passionately fighting the world because it's just logically impossible. You can't do that and have that outcome in the world. But this general theme of just, I don't know. I'm tired of saying it. Let's just move on.
This appears to be an economistic analysis. To paraphrase Justin Muller from the essay on anarchism in education which I shared on my channel earlier, the core of anarchism is an underlying skepticism towards hierarchy, and therefore socialism is an incidental feature of anarchism, as is opposition to patriarchy, for example. I don't think Engels' argument holds here because authority, understood in the sense of hierarchy and domination as a problem, is not confined only to the economic sphere.
I'm pausing here, fascinating as it is, to just make a point about anarchism versus Marxism. So, Marxism, we recognize class struggle, and we say everything to the masses, because it is through uniting as a class that the proletariat is able to win things for its members. Not as individuals, but as members of a class fighting for those collective class interests. For us, socialism is very much not incidental, but the only way to move from capitalism to something in which workers have more rights, more freedom, more dignity, etc. For anarchists, as the speaker just stated, the individual comes first. That's why the abolition of hierarchy, that's their priority, so that no individual is above any other individual. That is their priority. That is the thing that they are most interested in and want to go to first and foremost. And so for them, socialism is incidental because it might help to reduce hierarchy. Or patriarchy, fighting patriarchy is incidental because patriarchy puts men above women. But it doesn't explain it doesn't get to the root causes of any of those. Why do we have patriarchy? Why do we have capitalism? This is the whole point of historical materialism, is to explain those things. Where did you get the state from? What is it? It's managing the surplus produced by the use of technology, and that's how we got a state. And, class society came into existence out of our natural state. Like every other animal, we were hunter-gatherers. We lived just in balance with nature. We didn't have a big surplus from year to year. We basically just lived hand to mouth, day to day. Maybe we did very light agriculture for people who lived in a more sedentary way. But basically it was, hand to mouth. You had very minimal surplus maybe for the week. But you were basically starting from scratch every week or two. Now, several thousand years ago, large portions of humanity started moving away from that hunter-gatherer state of life. And there are possible material reasons for that, such as climate changes and things like that, that made farming more advantageous. But it also necessitated changes in our social arrangement because the way that we did labor was different. And anyway, that's a separate video. Marxism holds that if we want to get back to a state where people lived in relative freedom and there wasn't a state as we know it today, and there wasn't class struggle, class exploitation, class oppression. We want to get to that classless society again, but this time with hot running water and all the other conveniences of modern life, which allow us to develop in greater comfort in a wide variety of ways. Then we need to understand the dialectic of history, which has brought us to this moment, and then how to advance it beyond the state of class oppression and class war. Anarchists are just like, me, you not better than me, and everything else is incidental. This is a pretty bad approach. I don't know what else to say. It's overly simplistic. It doesn't really take anything into account about how we got into this situation. And that's why you don't see a lot of anarchists leading us out of this situation, whereas dozens of countries have implemented some form of Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, to fight their way out of capitalism into a new society where they're able to make significant strides towards equality and dignity and freedom for people. So that's a key thing to understand that differentiates, anarchists will often be like, well, Marxists and anarchists want the same thing. Well, maybe we can both say that someday off in the future, and Marxists would say when we basically have infinite surplus and surplus is no longer a concern, we've totally overcome any kind of natural scarcity whatsoever, then yeah, the state probably will wither away. But while we're still fighting off capitalism, that's not even remotely a possibility. Capitalism is, in 2021, still the dominant mode on the planet. And that's actually in part thanks to anarchists for their refusal to support actually existing socialism in its many forms. I can hear anarchists groaning now, but fuck you, because this is partly on you. You can see examples of anarchists turning on socialism over whatever fucking disagreement over words time and time again. That's a fact. So this primacy of the rights of the individual, that is anarchism. Lenin called this basically bourgeois ideology turned on its head, and so on. Anyway, let's get back to this. God, this stuff just, I don't miss this, let's put it that way.
But also exists in many other areas of life, such as race, gender, and sexuality. Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the political state, and with it political authority, will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution. That is, that public functions will lose their political character and will be transformed into the simple administrative functions of watching over the true interests of society. The elaborate straw man of anarchism continues.
Okay, whoa. So now he's back into his own argument, and honestly, it helps on the audio level if you say quote and unquote when you're starting and ending a quote block. That's really helpful. I mean, we only know visually because he switched the picture, but I'm reading along with the text, and I'm like, hey, those words aren't in this essay, yet he's reading them in the exact same tone. So, production note, maybe think about that. Okay, now what were you saying about the elaborate straw man? This is really cringy, but
the fact that anarchism is not limited to anti-statism, but is in fact more than anti-statism, is completely uncontroversial. This is just basic 101 stuff that Engels is missing. Anarchism comes from the Greek anarchos, meaning no rulers. This includes an opposition to capitalism, the patriarchal family structure, homophobia, transphobia, and so on. It is not merely limited to the state. Secondly, the points I made about getting rid of the division of labour also apply. That's necessary in the process of revolutionary change, otherwise there's a big risk of reproducing class relations. For example, having an elite class watching over the administrative functions of society. Finally, let's read the last of On Authority and be done with it. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished at one stroke, even before the social conditions that gave birth to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? This is not only ignorant, but offensive.
Buddy, your argument style is not so good. I'm exhausted. I don't know what to say here. So he basically interrupted Engels' thing to give that long previous comment. Let me read it again. Quote, "Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the political state, and with it political authority, will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution. That is, that public functions will lose their political character and will be transformed into the simple administrative functions of watching over the true interests of society." Unquote. So, in other words, meaning that the only government we will need is basically the technical administration of the stuff that produces goods and services. Okay? Continuing, quote, "But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished at one stroke. In other words, that's the first thing they want to do. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished at one stroke, even before the social conditions that gave birth to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority." Unquote. Okay, so I would agree with this criticism, because although Marxists also believe that you have to abolish what Lenin called the parasite state, you have to basically destroy the capitalist government. You can't simply just take it over. You have to get rid of that government and create a new type of government, a workers' state, because you're trying to do something in building socialism, which is quite different from governing capitalism. And therefore, you need a different type of system. For it, better just to throw the old one away and to start a new one. So Engels goes on, quote, "Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon. Authoritarian means," comment violent ones, "if such there be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Should we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough?" In other words, because the Paris Commune ultimately didn't last, and maybe it would have had they used more force against the forces of reaction. Okay. So now that we've digested that a little bit, minus the vitriol, I can't find a single thing to argue with here. What is this guy's problem going to be with it? Is it just Engels is misusing the term authority? Like, what in the substance are you disagreeing with here? Engels is saying, you demand that the political state is abolished before the conditions which gave rise to the state. I was just talking about that a few minutes back. The state didn't come out of thin air. It's not the product of the biblical fall. It arose out of material conditions governing the surplus and the use of technology in society thousands of years ago, which initiated the era of class struggle. Well, socialists are trying to end class struggle by understanding its origins and trying to work with that and be informed by its origins in coming up with a solution to it. And you can't just snap your fingers and entirely get rid of it. Okay, I'm probably over-explaining all of this, but really, I'm just trying to state and restate the proposition here within Engels' text, which this guy just seems to be so triggered by, because I'm trying to understand, hey, maybe this guy sees something in this that I don't. I'm trying sincerely to hear this out. And I'm hearing hyperventilation. On we go.
Extensively so. Consider, for example, the experience of Joseph de Jacques, the French anarcho-communist revolutionary and poet. He was organising for women's emancipation. Also, for his participation in the workers' uprising in Paris in June 1848, he had been imprisoned at Cherbourg and released in March 1849. Rearrested in June 1849 when the Royalists came back to power, he continued to be in and out of trouble. Consider the experience of Bakunin, whose ideas we have been quoting. He was imprisoned for years for participating in an insurrection. Eugène Varlin was tortured and shot. And here we have factory owner Engels telling us, have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? Again, this is offensively ignorant of history. Let's continue.
You didn't make a point. There was no point in that whatsoever. Okay.
A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets and cannon. Authoritarian means, if such there be at all, and if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. This is, again, embarrassing.
Well, please explain how. I don't agree, and I don't think I'm going to agree when you're done explaining because I don't agree with most of your explanations. I don't think most of your points really work or stick, and I think that you're trying to score points here on somebody who, meaning Engels, just had a much firmer command of this entire situation than you do.
Engels is saying, oh, you're anti-authoritarian and yet you're in favour of revolution. Curious. Don't you think that's a kind of authority? This is reactionary. It's almost on the level of the reverse racism logic.
No, it isn't, because Engels also was for revolution. So it's not hypocritical at all of him to say that. So in the meme you're trying to cite about, the peasant saying maybe we should improve society somewhat, and some smart guy pops up out of the well saying, oh, yet you participate in society. Curious. So the guy in the well doesn't want to change or improve society. But Engels in this case does, and in fact he's saying he has a more effective method than doing it than the obstructionist, wrecking anarchists who, in his and Marx's view, get in the fucking way. You giant dumbass. I'm sorry, but listening to this has really just worn me down. My God. I don't know. Are there people out there who find this brilliant? Because you're just flat wrong. This guy has not engaged with really any of the substance, other than agreeing with it, while stating that he does not.
The oppressed class using armed force to overthrow oppression and repress the capitalist class is in fact anti-authoritarian, and for Engels to argue otherwise is quite frankly a betrayal of socialist values. It is not the social revolution which is violent, but the institutions it seeks to abolish that are.
Okay, so yet again, you agree with Engels, again, but are really angry about it apparently, and you're insisting that you're not agreeing with him. So yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the Marxist position that workers defending themselves against exploitation by capital is justified, and capitalism is what they're trying to get rid of. So what is your fucking problem? I just don't get this. I do, just going in circles here. Total waste of time and energy.
Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of the authority of the armed people against the bourgeois? Should we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough? Again, the same point applies. Anarchists consistently advocate armed insurrection. Engels leaves us with this. Therefore, either one of two things. Either the anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they are creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, and in that case they are betraying the movement of the proletariat. In either case, they serve the reaction. So let's just sum up Engels' argument. He misses basic 101 stuff such as the distinction between hierarchical authority and competent authority. He misses the point about delegation used to coordinate large-scale industry. And then he calls revolution authoritarian. Self-described socialists in the modern day who refer to Engels as on authority as if it were some kind of definitive proof that anarchism is unworkable are not only ignoring all of these things, they're not only ignoring the history of the libertarian wing of the socialist movement and not adjusting their theory accordingly, but also on authority is a brief train of thought. It's not a rigorous and systematic piece of literature like Capital, for example. Herein lies the obvious drawback of adopting a philosophy wherein you worship specific individuals and treat their words as gospel, no matter how logically flawed, offensively ignorant and reactionary they happen to be. Also, I want to say to any Marxist watching, just saying the words material conditions as if they are imbued with some kind of special power that magically absolves you of having to make a decent argument for your position is a cop-out. To me, citing on authority as if to say, back in your box anarchists, Engels disagrees with you, is in the same ballpark as that kind of thing. Just because Engels thinks X, that doesn't mean that X is true. The good thing about being an anarchist is that you don't have to worship an individual or group. When engaging with texts, you take what's true and disregard what's wrong. And by the way, just because I've quoted some of Bakunin's writings here, that doesn't mean that I agree with everything he says. Bakunin was an anti-Semite, for example. Obviously, anti-Semitism is absolutely condemnable, and I don't agree with Bakunin's anti-Semitic views. However, I do think that Bakunin was right, specifically concerning the materialist conception of freedom and his ideas about competent authority based on expertise. Other anarchists have written about these same topics since, but the reason why I quoted Bakunin was because Bakunin was of Engels' time, and so there's a need to place Engels in his historical context, and that's what I was trying to do there. But all the same, it is necessary to revise theory when revolutionary praxis proves it wrong, as it did during the Spanish Revolution. This has been Libertarian Communist Platform. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please...
Well, I didn't. That was absolutely insufferable. That was one of the most grating things. By the end of this, I just, like, my God. I think I've said everything that I want to say here. It's just, when somebody is that set on not getting it, what can you do? The whole point of this was Engels was trying to get people to consider the meaning of the word authority. I think that point went over this guy's head, and he just got angry and went into it, and in my opinion, made a fool of himself. Insufferable, grating, and I must say, I like this guy a lot better when he was doing an angry video game nerd. Much more likable character. With that, what do you think? Leave a comment below, and we'll continue the discussion in the comments. It's going to be my last Hanging with the BreadTube Gang video for the day. I am done. I did 8 of these in the last 2 days, and I'm ready to jump off a bridge. So, thanks for watching. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is encouraging. It's also materially helpful. So thank you all. It helps make this channel possible, and it keeps me making more content than I would otherwise. So I do appreciate that. If you'd like to help out without a donation, liking, subscribing, commenting, clicking the notification bell, and sharing this video with other people on your social media, etc. That helps to boost the channel, put it in front of more people, and expand the conversation, whatever it is that you do, online and in your community, to advance the cause of socialism. Thanks for doing it. Join an organization if there's a good one in your area. Look around, there just might be. And we'll catch you in the next video.